Very much. Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. My name is Steve Bromley, and today I wanted to talk about the production process and reveal some opportunities for us to integrate player insight throughout. How can you get understanding of what your players think, understand and enjoy, and use that to de-risk the games that you're making? A little bit about my background. So I am a games user researcher. I've run playtests and studies. I've been in the game industry for about 13 years. I've worked with a few studios here in Guildford, especially during my time at PlayStation. We've done one Guildford game, Rush of Blood, that was made in Guildford. And since then, I've been a consultant. I help teams both with running studies and also establish playtesting and user research throughout the development process. I've written a couple of books about user research. I do a lot of advocacy and mentoring in this space. But today, I'm going to start by telling you something you already know. You know that game development is risky. Every week, hundreds of games are released on Steam. Most of them fail to sell 100 copies. Most studios fold after their first game. Similar on the App Store, and as we've seen over the last year, it's a really difficult time to successfully make games. When you look at some of the factors that cause unsuccessful games to come out, to exist, some of the themes that come up are production risk. Actually, could the team get together and make the game they wanted to make in the time they wanted to make it? And there's a lot of great work done by producers and project managers through iterative development practice to try and minimize that risk. A second factor that causes studios to struggle is just market risk. Are there people out there who will buy games in this genre? Is it right time for this type of game? And again, there's a lot of work that market research teams and studios will do to size the market that will help de-risk that. The element I'm most interested in, and the focus of what I want to cover today, is that third one, experience risk. You have a game that you have the ability to make a game, you've made it in a popular genre. How confident are you that players will understand and enjoy it and actually stick with the game that you're making? So I could and frequently do talk about this for hours. I know we've only got 12 and a half minutes today. So I've picked a couple of areas to specifically throughout the development process, which I think can have a lot of impact. Ultimately, the reason why we want to do this, though, is because it's a nice balance of the creativity of game development. You're making something players enjoy and like, you're putting a positive thing into the world, with the business of game development. By putting that effort into understanding players and integrating that understanding throughout production, you're going to make it cheaper to find players and easier to retain players once you've found them. It makes production less chaotic, it makes scoping easier, you have to throw out less work later on when you realise actually we're going to cut that whole feature. And ultimately it creates a team who are aligned and have that shared understanding of what we're making, and you can make confident decisions throughout development knowing you all know what we're trying to make. So starting right at the beginning with ideation. Now, as a team, you'll probably be thinking about your goals from ideation. We want to find one or more ideas that we think feel good and we think we could build a game around. And also we want to start to describe what is the vision of this game. What do we think players do? What do we think players will feel? What do we think we're putting into the world? Usually at this point you have very limited code. You don't have a huge amount to show players. And so probably the best investment of your time is spent actually coming up with a shared understanding within your team. Who are we making this for, and what do we need to know about them to make good decisions? Throughout the rest of development, you're going to have to make confident predictions about what players understand, what we need to tutorialize, what are they going to enjoy, what should we prioritize our attention on, and that's much easier if you spend some time to understand actually who are our players and share that understanding within your team. So the type of thing that you might want to explore is what other games are people who I intend to play my game going to be playing. Why do they play those games? What's the context of playing those games? Where are they? How long's a play session? What does gaming look like in players' real life? So that you can use that to inform the design decisions you have to make. You can pick actually how long will it be between save points, or what will we need to tutorialize versus what can we expect players to understand before they come to us. To learn this, it is the most difficult study. Just spending one-to-one time talking to players of competitive games gives a huge amount of depth and quality of understanding of what people are doing. Those themes start to emerge reasonably early. If you're not able to run this as a dedicated study, even just adding an extra 5 minutes to other playtests you're running where you talk to your players about what else they're playing and why they play it, will start to build up that shared understanding in your team of who are we making this for. Exploring what other games they're playing and why they play those games is tremendously valuable. You'll know that you've done enough in ideation, you've understood enough about your players. If you're reaching the end of ideation and you know that actually you've got some ideas that we feel good about, one of the things we don't have time for today is how to playtest that bit as well, but again, we can talk about that at a later point. And making sure you've got that shared understanding across your team. Everyone who's going to have to make design, development, prioritization decisions has a shared understanding of who we're making this for and who our players are. You'll then likely be moving into pre-production. And as I'm sure most people know, your goal from pre-production is to take those best ideas, those things you've ideated, and see, can we make a full game around this? If we put these systems together and created perhaps a vertical slice, does this hang together as an experience that we could make more of? Ultimately, you as a team are probably building out the best ideas, seeing if they come together, and then using that to anticipate the size of production. It took us this long to make this aspect of the game. We anticipate this much more content. Now we know what production will look like. The most valuable use of your time with players here is to validate that core game loop. When you hit production later on, it's going to become so much more expensive to make changes. You'll have committed to things, you'll have started creating assets and code, and it'll just be very hard to make changes at that point. You want to leave pre-production with an understanding that if we build more of the same, this will work. The types of things you want to be exploring with players include, do players enjoy this? What's good about this experience that we should emphasize and we should prioritize for production and make sure that we're putting most effort into? What bits are not landing yet? And so we'll either consider that first to come when we have to cut scope later on, or dedicate more time to iteration to it so that we make sure that we do have the best possible implementation of this when we're taking it forward. Again, the type of studies you might be doing for this are reasonably qualitative. You're probably spending one-to-one time with players, sitting them in front of your early prototypes and your vertical slice, seeing what the experience is, asking some qualitative questions to get that understanding. And if you do need to see how representative that what you're getting from a qualitative study is, this might be the first time you want to do a mass playtest, bringing in multiple players and trying to see how representative the qualitative data you're getting is for a wider audience. You'll know you're ready to leave pre-production because you'll be confident that actually if we build more of this, players will enjoy it, and so more of this could be a game that hangs together. And also you'll have an idea of your roadmap for production. When later on you will inevitably have to cut things, that's how that happens every time, right? You'll know what is first in line to be cut, what things should we be saving, and what is the most important part of our experience. That brings you to production. Now, production is when, obviously, your team size will grow, you start creating content. You're going to build the whole game, and ultimately, one of the things you and your team will be thinking about as you go through is how expensive changes are at this point. So we want to reduce scope creep, we want to reduce rework, we want to make sure that we have as stable as possible production process. Again, there are a couple of research studies that could be running with players at this time. One of the ones I think is most important, and again, due to time, the only one from production that I'll talk about, is this is when you should start doing depth usability studies. You're going to be creating a lot of content, you'll be making new scenarios, new tutorials, new puzzles, you'll be making bits of things that players will experience, and you have an assumption about how will players understand this, will they be able to get through it, what emotional reactions would we expect players to have this section of the game, for example. And those type of questions about players' enjoyment, players' understanding, ultimately, is it landing and working, are the type of things that, again, you can do one-to-one moderated playtests. You could do that iteratively, putting players in front of it, seeing what works, and then next week, having made some small changes to it, seeing if we fix some of the tutorial issues we've seen, for example, is a reasonably common study that we run. This, in combination with larger quant studies, which again I won't talk about today, will help make sure that every aspect of your game is being received in the way in which you hope players expect it to, and the vision that you're putting out into the world is the same as the one you have in your head. Ultimately, to be confident moving on from production, you should be confident that players understand how to use each of the systems that you run. And also, with some other methods that we won't talk about today, ultimately, does this come together and do players enjoy what we've made during production? The last stage, post-production, and also going to that launch period, especially if you're a live service game or free-to-play or something on mobile, you'll be looking at balance primarily, looking out for pacing issues, looking out for difficulty spreads, things that stop that flow state for players. Also, your QA team will be looking to identify and remove bugs, and you'll be starting to think about what's next. Where is our effort best spent in post-productions, in future content? One of the studies you can look at, especially if you are a live service environment, or you're in early access, or you are a free-to-play game, is this when you just start looking at optimizing retention. For many games, the launch is only the beginning, and you want to keep players engaged for a longer period of time. You can run studies to work out when a player is going to churn, what's going to cause them to churn, and then what interventions you can do to bring them back. Ultimately, you want to look out for what issues are causing you to lose players in that first week of play or first month of play, and what's causing people to quit these games. As a method, this is often a longitudinal study, is a fancy word for it. Diary study is another one where we'll get players to play every day for a month or a week and log their experience as they go through, often recording video content of what they're doing each day or surveys each day about their experience, and using that to see what are the key indicators that some of that player is going to churn. Combining that with game analytics, especially if you're in a live environment where you can see real churn issues, will give you an understanding of not just where churn is happening, but also why it's happening and what you as a team can do about it. Ultimately, with that post-production process, if you've done enough research, you'll know that you've got that consistent experience for players. They're going through it without difficulty spikes or losing that flow state, and ultimately your game is meeting best-in-class retention metrics and other ways of measuring is this game going well. I've only been able to talk about a few studies today. Ultimately, there's a whole bunch more that you could be doing throughout that production process. At the end, I'll share a link to where there's a free guide to be able to learn how to run some of these studies. But the last thing I want to cover in the last 2.5 minutes is why playtests go wrong. And frequently, one of the first conversations that teams have and that they bring me in to talk about is why they're getting poor return on investment for their playtests. They're running them and they're thinking, this is just showing up issues that we already knew, or it's not really relevant, it's not stuff we can act on. And ultimately, they've tried playtesting and user research and not seen the value from it. When I've spoken to teams and worked through that process of why that's occurring, ultimately it often comes down to 3 issues. First is wrong players, so finding people who are not representative of your real players and using them for your playtests. Now, there are some values on internal playtesting for team alignment and making sure that everyone has a shared understanding of what we're making. But if you're often, teams end up using either people from the studio, friends and family, their existing community, other game devs, these type of people to take part in their playtests. And what we see is that data isn't representative of their real players. They're going to find some opinions and find some issues, but that won't actually map to the new player experience that a real player would have playing their game. And ultimately isn't hugely useful at that point because you can't act on it if you don't know this is representative of our real players. The second issue that often comes up is just not being sure what you want to learn from your playtests. A default behavior for many teams is linking that to milestones. So we've reached our alpha milestone, we've reached our beta milestone, now we're going to do a playtest. I understand why that happens. It's often harder to get a build together before this point. So it seems a natural point when you've got a build, now is your playtest. But you've divorced the process of running a playtest or user research from decision making. You're doing it because you've hit a milestone rather than using it to inform a decision you want to make. And instead with teams spending time understanding what decisions we're going to make, what are the biggest risks for us currently, what are we not confident about, and then using that to inform what type of study we're going to run is usually a better investment than time. The last one, and this is the case for every discipline I'm sure, is it just gets left too late. Everything else is always on fire, then you just don't have time to prioritise user research or playtesting, and then when you learn a whole bunch of issues that you just have no ability to act on. Now, truthfully, what some of the things I flagged today are some ways to think about playtesting earlier, but again, that's a process that I've going to have to work through with teams on how they unlock iterative, smaller tests than the big playtests they're currently running. Ultimately, the theme of what I'm going to talk about today, to wrap up, is about the potential for player insight and player data throughout development. Games are a creative industry, and so it's nice to make nice things that players enjoy and like, but also we have to show the value of this in business terms, because games isn't just creativity, it's also business. Through making it cheaper to find players, easier to retain players, through putting some sense and order on that production process and making it easier to prioritise throughout production, and through just having a team who are more confident and able to make these type of decisions, I think there's huge value in doing user research around development, and so that's why I'm very enthusiastic about coming to talk about this today. If this has been interesting, I've got a website, gamesuserresearch.com. It has free guides on how to run these type of playtests. Also, if you or a team just need support, I run studies, I help teams run studies. And as you've probably got, I love talking about user research, and so I've been enthusiastic about talking about it later today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to questioning talks. Thank you.